Welcome back to our webinar series that's titled Bad Surveys Can Sink Your Brand. And we've written up, it's over 100 different tips, the potential pitfalls that organizations and businesses face sometimes when they're developing their own customer surveys. And we've created a number of different categories in this series. This one's dedicated, it's the first one in question type and design that we're going to be covering today. Real quickly, if you haven't seen the intro webinar, please go visit and watch it. But if you haven't, I'm going to do a quick, basically rundown of what that entire intro looks like. The goal of this entire series with Bad Surveys Can Sink Your Brand is about enlightenment. It's about understanding the implications of these potential pitfalls organizations face. But most importantly, what's a better way moving forward when it comes to customer survey design and deployment. So who and what is CraniumTap? We're a marketing research firm that takes pride in striking a balance between marketing and research. So understanding both of these worlds is important in designing the most effective research solutions. We're all about being grounded, making sure we're smart in design and efficient with businesses' time. And we're not like the other guys, as you'll see throughout this entire webinar series. Myself, my name is Adam Cook. I've been in marketing research for over 20 years now. I've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to get recognition internationally and nationally, have a number of published methods in marketing research publications, and I'm professionally research certified by the Insights Association. So I know in 2020, we're facing some really challenging times as businesses, and we're trying to map out short-term and long-term strategies moving forward. A lot of businesses recognize that they have to reach out to customers to get a better understanding of where they need to move in terms of their products, services, and their strategies moving forward. So we're seeing surveys go out left and right. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of businesses that are not aware of these pitfalls as they're releasing these surveys and sending them out to customers. And we're going to cover that today. With that in mind, if you haven't seen the movie Matrix, there's a scene in it where they talk about taking the red pill, the blue pill. The red pill will wake you up and you'll see the truth. And we're not going to pull any punches. We're going to share some of the pitfalls that maybe yourself or a lot of organizations have accidentally made. But we're going to share better methods moving forward. Just be aware, we're sharing examples that are real, that businesses have used throughout this entire webinar series. But always keep in mind, it's not your fault. I've got 20 years of experience doing this, hundreds, if not thousands of surveys that I've developed and designed and learned from the years. But you could be in a situation where you're doing it yourself, or you have a marketing department that may not have expertise specifically in research. It's not really your fault. Same with sometimes consultants. Their expertise may not be in research. It's not always going to be their fault. But I will say, if you are reaching out to a marketing research firm and they're falling into some of these pitfalls, I got to say it is their fault. And this is an opportunity for you to work with them and hold them accountable as well. When it comes to developing customer surveys, there are three key components to designing one that's successful. One is creating a positive user experience. Two is making sure that the surveys are designed to give you actionable insights. And lastly, the entire experience and the insights that are provided need to have a positive impact on your brand. With that, there are a number of contributing factors that impact all these areas. And that comes into your lead-up language and the language that you use following surveys, as well as the survey design itself, the language that you use specifically within questions, and then the question types and design that we're going to start covering in today's session, and then lastly, the analytical approaches that you use. But when the day is done, all three of these work together to create a positive survey experience. And that is, things like user experience have an impact on the insights that you get, and it obviously has a direct impact on the perception of your brand. Getting actionable insights is key to having a strong user experience and maximizing the responses that you get. And those obviously have a direct impact on your brand decisions and your business decisions. And then lastly, positive brand impact. Surveys represent an opportunity to reach out to customers and to build on that brand that you have and the reputation that you have with customers. And that generates strong insights as well. So let's get to it. Today we're covering question type and design. If I'm not mistaken, this is the first of just 3 series that we broke out specifically to this area. So tip 37 and 38, when it comes to survey question design, limit the amount of open-ended questions that you have to offer. I can't recommend enough how important it is to make sure that you're in a point and click environment more so, especially when you're doing digital surveys, than collecting open-ended feedback. Generally, I know from our experience, we see that usually somewhere between 10% or less of respondents are willing to give open-ended feedback, so it only appeals to a small minority of respondents. And it can take time for people to give responses, and time can be a killer in surveys. So try to minimize the amount of open ends that you have. And tip 38 is really focused on, do not start that survey with an open-ended question. That is not that's not the way that you want to introduce your brand or the survey to potential respondents. If you're right out of the gate asking for open-ended feedback, you're likely going to increase the dropout rate on surveys. And that's something that obviously has a negative impact on the insights that you're trying to gather. So I'm going to give an example here from a city survey that we saw within a region that we serve businesses. From your perspective, what 3 words best describes Springfield's brand personality compared to other cities? Springfield is, and then they had 3 options to fill in here for open ends. I can tell you in this survey, this was question number 3 on a 33 question survey. And there were also 6 additional text field required open-ended questions on that survey. That's not the best experience to offer to respondents. So again, try to avoid right out of the gate asking a question like this. It's not a good introductory into a survey itself. Try to push it as far back to the survey as possible, if you even have to ask it at all. Look for better ways to ask questions. So tip 39, if there is a space box available to collect open-ended responses, make sure it's large enough for respondents to see most, if not everything, that they're including in this. And I'm speaking in the digital world, someone typing in responses. And you might be wondering, what am I talking about? Well, here's an example off of a recent COVID survey that we saw in terms of which of the following reflects your workforce reduction issues due to the COVID-19 crisis. And then there was select all, and there was an other option below. And when you selected it, a box appears and you could enter in your response. That is a screen image of the, me trying to type in exactly what I wanted to communicate here. Now, as a respondent, people start typing in answers, whether it's on their smartphone or a laptop. It becomes challenging when you're not able to see the entire narrative that you're trying to communicate to the business that's asking questions. This was what we call a non-adaptive text field. It was a fixed box. It did not change according to what I was typing in. So our example solution is, check the software that you're using, make sure it has an adaptable field at the bottom. In this instance, we had one. The box increases the more text that a respondent types in. And they're able to see the entire narrative of everything that they're typing, and it just generates a better user experience. Tip number 40, know when not to use randomization in questions. A typical technique in research for multi-select or single select questions is when you have multiple options, that when it's presented to respondents, that it's presented to them in a randomized technique. So each respondent gets it in a different order. It's to avoid what we call potential order bias. So if they always get them the same way, every respondent, there is some possible concern that maybe the first thing is more likely to be selected, and that's a way to avoid it. But that's not the case for every question. There's going to be instances where you want to keep it the same order. Great examples are like if it's a geographic-based question, you want to have it in alphabetical order. Another good example is if we were working with like a furniture retailer and they're asking a number of different questions that are tied to their competitive set. If there are questions that are asking, which retailer do you believe represents this specific brand attribute, you're going to ask, 5 or 6 of those questions. You don't want to have those options randomized. And the reason for that is, again, the respondent experience. You want to minimize their time. And if you're going to have that form of redundancy in the types of things that you're measuring, you don't want to create a shell game. on the respondents, and they're basically trying to hunt and find the one now that it's randomized. Where in this instance, if you have them always in alphabetical order, it's easier for the respondent to find the answer that best suits the question that they're trying to respond to. Tip number 41, at the best you can, try to reduce the potential for redundancies in questions. This, again, can produce a bad user experience if it just feels like, didn't you just ask me that question? I felt like that was very similar to something that was asked before. Here's an example. So these were two different questions in the same questionnaire. In fact, one did come right after the other. The first one, please rate how well you think each of the following descriptions describe downtown Springfield. And then it was followed by a question, how well do you think each of these attributes describes downtown Springfield? It's subtle, they sound very similar, and in fact, when you look at the scales, it's the exact same scale. So there's the possibility of confusion with the respondent when it's presented this way, but at the same time, if it were better written, we could have integrated these elements together. And that's the solution example that we get. So it's all about consolidating. How much would you agree with the following statements about downtown Springfield? And then we can integrate all those elements that were in those two different questions that we saw on the previous slide. Another example of potential redundancy. Now this starts with an open-ended. What are the top 3 things you like most about downtown Springfield as the setting for your job? And then it's just open-ended text field. I can type in what those top 3, or excuse me, what those things I like most are. And then it was followed with a question, which one feature or aspect of downtown Springfield do you like best? Sounds similar, doesn't it? It's, we could have probably avoided the open-ended question to begin with if it was, better written. Again, there's an opportunity to collapse or consolidate the possible redundancy that we see in these two question examples. So our solution, how valuable do you consider having the following around your downtown Springfield workday? Now you go back to the open-ended, that they wanted to know what I like most. Well, if it's designed right and you have all the different attributes that you believe are going to be valuable to the potential respondent base, you're going to get those answers on the analysis. And then we don't even have to mention features specifically per se. And then it's a better designed and written survey question. But we still have the other things of extreme value not listed below. So it plays as a backup instead of a first question in this instance. Here's a third example in terms of potential redundancy. What steps have you already taken to mitigate COVID-19's impact on your company? Select all to apply. You start to see a long list, and I mean long list of different things that people could select. Then it was followed with a question, what additional steps have you already taken to mitigate COVID-19's impact on your workers? It's just after that long list, it makes people wonder, how do you not know what it is, the steps that I've taken? And it begs the question of, there's a subtle difference in the writing of the questions themselves that could potentially confuse people. You're asking about the company in the first question, and then the next one you're asking about your workers. So is it different or is it the same? The other challenge you also want to avoid is asking people to list things out or ask for steps that they're taking. That means you're asking them to give a long narrative of feedback, and that's a lot to ask of respondents. So these questions have a number of challenges with respondents. So tip 42, avoid using radial point matrices or Likert scales. And we'll show you an example here in a second. It's, whenever you see all those radial points on one screen, it can create what we call either a battleship or a bingo card effect. And that type of effect can have a negative impact on the user experience for respondents. It can be visually straining, and that can feed dropouts, frustration, and then add time as well. So here's an example of a question. How important is it to you that each of the following areas be addressed by Springfield Community College in the next 3 years? You can see a long list of different things that they want the respondents to rate, and then you see a description for each of the 5 points. First thing, a note, the scale is actually displayed in the wrong direction. You usually want to start with the negative and move toward the positive from left to right. But you can see the overwhelming nature of all these points. And then the respondent themselves has to go in and say, look, the student experience, and then they start looking over and up at their responses, and they have to do this match game. That adds time, and time can be deadly for a user experience and the maximum responses that you get from the field that you sampled. And then it just obviously has a negative impact on the experience overall. Here's our example solution. In that instance, you could probably break up the elements as well, just so it's not a long list. But we use visual sliding anchor scales. It avoids that radial point, overwhelming nature, that battleship effect that you can see in surveys sometimes. And it leans more heavily on gut response, and they're just focused on, where does it feel like it falls on the scale? And then they're not obsessed with finding the point on the scale that matches the description that was offered above. Makes the experience a lot easier, and it gets respondents through the survey quicker. Tip 43, don't switch scales around. You don't want to disorient respondents. So what do I mean by this? I'll show you an example here. This was all from one survey. You can see the first question has a 5-point scale, and it has 2 extreme descriptors. One is fairly negative, fairly positive. Then the next question has a series of things that are rated here. It's 1 to 5 again, listed vertically, but instead of fairly to fairly, it's not at all to extremely. And then it was followed with a question that was a scale of 0 to 10, not at all to extremely, and then another scale of 1 to 5, lowest to highest, and then another scale of 1 to 5, completely to completely. This example survey has 7 different variations within just these 5 questions of scales. That's a lot of reorientation for respondents, and that again adds time and potential frustration in that experience. So do your best to stick to a one method in terms of the display, vertical or horizontal. We recommend that you stick to the same extreme descriptions. Sometimes just stick to not at all something to extremely something else, and then just stick to that throughout the entire survey. That continuity makes it easier for respondents to make their way through the survey. They don't feel like they have to reorient themselves when it comes to a new question, and there's new scale descriptors, and there's new numeric scales, and you flipped it from horizontal to vertical. You want to minimize that potential confusion. Tip 44, when it comes to scales, sometimes you do have to remember that if you have extremes, that there is sometimes that option for respondents to have neutrality. And you want to make sure that's a clear option for people. Some researchers will say we want a forced response in terms of we really want to know if they feel one way or the other, and we're going to force them to answer that way. I'm in the camp of consumers, humans, people sometimes are indifferent about things. They don't feel one way or the other. We need to capture that. It's important. That's important in the analysis. We don't want to force people into a scientific environment that says you have an either or choice. Sometimes you have that choice of not choosing at all. So here's an example problem question with a solution offered as well. You saw earlier, generally was your overall perception of downtown Springfield, more negative, and then you have fairly negative to fairly positive. And there's nothing describing, is there anything neutral? I guess you could assume 3 is neutral, but it's just opposing ends. Just make sure you have that sort of opt-out option included on your survey. So you can see our example below. We included one, we actually expand the survey descriptions in terms of the scale itself to extremely negative to extremely positive, and then we offer that neutral description in the middle as well. Tip 45, make sure you're using the same scale throughout the entire survey, and one that matches the question or the elements you want respondents to be rating. So this is flipping things on its head a little bit from some stuff that we touched on earlier, where we saw scales moving all over the place. But sometimes businesses or researchers just want to use the same type of scale, and they use it throughout the entire survey. and it's without looking at what you're measuring. And sometimes that scale may not match what you're measuring. So we have an example here from a pediatric office, and they were measuring different elements of their experience, whether it was with the actual care provider or with their efforts or their communications or with a nurse's assistant. Sometimes the scale itself, very poor to very good, doesn't seem to fit right for all the elements that they were measuring. So you always need to go back and reread and say, does that make sense? Is there a better way to do this? Our solution in this instance is do a better setup, and then you can use the same scale throughout. So we changed it to how satisfied were you with the following experiences you had at your last visit to Springfield Pediatrics. That setup enables us to use the same scale of not at all satisfied to extremely satisfied throughout the entire survey. And then again, it creates better continuity for the respondent, better experience, and you're going to get better data in the end. Tip 46, don't use scales that are unequally balanced. And this instance, it can sway how people answer, and it can sway the results. Let's give you an example. So based on this visit, what is the likelihood that you will visit kidsretailoutfitters.com in the next 6 months? And then it's given a 5-point scale, not at all likely, not very likely, somewhat likely, likely, and highly likely. Looks like a typical question we'd all run into. By the way, Kids Retail Outfitters is not real. We replaced that name to save face for the organization that had this question. But notice 2 out of the 5 elements on the scale here are negative. Not at all, not very, whereas 3 were positive. Now, when you get the answers back, it's already leaning, mathematically more likely to have a perceived positive experience. And that's not honest feedback in the analysis. You got to be aware of those potential unequal scales. So our solution here is literally taking out the middle anyway and just having the 2 extremes. Not at all to extremely in terms of their most recent visit in their descriptions. Tip 47, make sure that the question type you're using makes sense for the options that you're using for single selection questions. Sometimes people are not just a single element. They can be multiple things that you're collecting. So again, we're using a child outfitter questionnaire that we came across. Which of the following categories best describe you? And it only enabled me to select one option here. So I'm either a mom or expecting, or dad or expecting, or any of these other elements. But it takes out of the equation that, well, I could be more than one thing here when it comes to self-description. And it's forcing me to select something, and it's not accounting for all those things. Something else you need to keep in mind when it comes to questions about parentage as well is just be careful about using terms like dads and moms. It's just like not all parents are quote unquote dads and moms. Sometimes there's stepmoms, stepdads, there's guardians, sometimes grandparents are the acting parents. Just be careful with the technical terms that you use sometimes on surveys, and just be sensitive towards some of those things as well. But our solution here is, which of the following describes the purpose of your last visit? And then we're collecting all the different reasons they could have been there. The last question just assumes that I was visiting because I was a mom or buying for someone else. I could have been buying for multiple reasons though. It could have been for a friend, it could have been for my family as well. But it's irrelevant whether I was a mom or dad anyway. It was more about the purpose. Then you can ask a question later in terms of things like gender or whatever else. But again, just be cognizant, sometimes you can be more than one of the answers that are offered on a single selection question. That sums up this portion of this webinar series. Be aware that we're continuing to drop a number of different elements in this 12-part series that are tied to these 5 key areas that impact a positive customer experience, and that can lift your brand instead of sinking it when it comes to devising and developing and deploying these surveys. Also be aware that we're going to continue to offer insights on different marketing research topics that are tied to things like, customer segmentation or persona development and analysis, geographic analyses, focus groups, how to employ the appropriate gap analyses and some other really geeky things that are tied into research and analysis that are important for organizations to understand and to avoid potential pitfalls there as well. Also be aware when we're sharing our research methods and backgrounds, typically we're employing peer-reviewed published methods that, if not, are developed by other organizations, they were developed by us as an organization ourselves. And then lastly, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to visit our website at CraniumTap.com, or if you want to email us directly, you can email us at insights@CraniumTap.com. And if you already have an existing contact with our parent organizations, a representative, don't hesitate to reach out to them as well. Thank you for your time.